Hello, Dr. Robyne Hanley-Dafoe.
Well, good morning. Hello, Peter Katz. How are you today?
Well, isn't that a loaded question?
Isn't it a big question?
It's like, I feel like you should be able to ask that question to people and then give them a list of categories, like a Jeopardy board or something. Mm-hmm. Be like, there's your, how are you doing physically? How are you doing mentally? I think you could then subdivide that again. And but I think if I just go with this moment right now, I'm grateful to be here with you, and I feel capable of just being present for this, and I will presence that this is a big time in my life, and so there's many layers to that answer when I think about how is it going. And what about you, Robyne? How are you doing?
Again, I echo that sentiment that it depends on what category or what criteria we're using. But it reminds me, Peter, of this idea about when we were doing research about this idea of like connecting with people and asking people how they are. One of the things that we've seen, and it was replicated in other areas of the research, is that, people always answer with like good, tired, okay, fine, or busy, right? Like these are like almost like those kind of like sociably acceptable. I'm just going to throw out tired, good, busy, fine, or okay, or even like meh. And what I find so fascinating is like often when I hear somebody say that in response to me, and if we do have like a close relationship, my next kind of follow-up question is always, how are you really? And I think anyway, that there's like certain people who get that information, and I think so often, given that people are asking that question quite flippantly, it's okay that we have these like stock answers and we just kind of like, yeah, we're good, and move along. But every once in a while, when we have that opportunity to share with someone and we can actually, follow up the how are you really, to then be able to say, you know what, today, barely holding on, right? Or I'm running on ego and caffeine and I'm hoping that's going to get me through my day, whatever that might be. So I appreciate that sentiment that when a person asks, how are you? It's complex. It's complex.
Yeah. I mean, how are you is like, I think about sometimes if I'm walking by my neighbors, like we literally say, how are you? But we don't even answer. It's like, that's like the hello, like, hey, how's it going? And then, hey, how's it going? But that's not a question. It's more of a statement.
Yes.
And I appreciate what you just said about, how are you doing really, or how's it going really? Actually, in my keynotes, I sometimes talk about this concept of lifelines, which are those one or two key people with whom you kind of don't have that disconnect between how you need to be on the outside and how it feels to be who you are on the inside. And I developed a little sentence with my lifelines that we use, and the sentence is, what's your update?
I love that.
And because that's a bit of a pattern interrupt. Like I think unless you're in the military, people aren't generally asking you for, what's your update?
Yes.
Sergeant. But like we kind of use that in select moments where, the person asking it is in the space to be able to hold space for the other person. Mm-hmm. So it's like, hey, I'm ready to receive the full answer. And I just find being able to have those periodical kind of deeply authentic moments. And sometimes it's just a text message like, hey, what's your update? And I'm like, but I know that I'm not burdening the other person. I know that they really want to know. So I just sort of feel that kind of held space and compassion. It's really, really made a difference over my life to have those sustained over a long period of time check-ins.
Yeah, Peter, that's so special. And those are so important to be able to have. And I love that idea about how's your update. I've actually started using that with the children in our kind of quick little passings, being like, hey, any updates? And then they kind of are able to kind of pause, right? And be like, oh, here are a few things that I wanted to share with you. And then we can move on. And it just kind of moves the conversation to that place where we're getting to the good stuff. And so I really appreciate that. there's one piece that I just want to latch on to that you said there about, that person was like kind of ready for you to hear it when they say, hey, what's your update? And one of the things that we see often when I'm supporting people who've, experienced, perhaps trauma or like challenging situations is that we have this propensity to feel like we're too much for people, especially if we're emotional people and creative people. And we sometimes have that feeling that it's like, oh my gosh, when they say, how are you? And, you have another crisis that you're stick handling or another big world thing that you're carrying. Sometimes we start to feel like, gosh, I am too much, or there's something wrong and I don't want to be a burden to somebody else. And I find myself, especially having gone through some pretty challenging seasons in my adulthood, that I started to carry more than my fair share by myself because I felt this pressure that I just didn't want to like impose or, burden anyone else with the things that I was going with. And on the other side, there also felt like there was a wee bit of stigma that, this is Robyne just being a little hurricane and just going around and her life is always in chaos. And sometimes I find that a wee bit tricky for a lot of people, especially people who care deeply and who are present and are aware of what's going on. And I remember coming across this one idea when I was working with someone, and every once in a while when you're, in the therapeutic relationship and, there's kind of like a stillness and then all of a sudden something is shared and it just lands, right? Like it's almost as if it was like, that's exactly what my soul needed to hear in that moment. And this woman said to me, Robyne, you don't have to be easy to love. You don't have to be easy to love. It's okay that you have a lot of layers and complexities and that you're a lot and your life is full. And you don't have to make yourself easy to love for other people because for the right people, you're just enough.
That hit me. That's a good one. And I appreciate that distinction. And the truth of the matter is with my lifelines, there's never a bad time for us to check in or support with each other. It's not like we sort of have an agreement, like you said, like you don't have to be easy to love and it's not a burden. I think the what's your update is just like, sometimes it's just like an out of the blue. It's not in the crisis moment necessarily.
Yes.
It's just like, hey, I was thinking about you, and whatever is happening in your life, I'd like to know because I care about you. And so, I appreciate that distinction. Yeah.
My favorite way to send out those like thinking of you texts sometimes is always I start with the like, you don't need to respond. I just want you to know that like you're on my heart, you're on my mind, and hope you're having a good day or a good week. And what's so interesting, often the first response that I get back when I share that with a close friend is like, these are the ones I want to respond to, Robyne.
Right.
Like there's that kind of, as soon as we have that permission that like, oh, hey, you don't have to respond. I just want you to know that you're cared for and you're thought about. It's quite interesting that those are the ones that like, those are the emails that are really easy to respond to, or those text messages are a lot easier to respond to.
I've received those messages from you, and I'm always grateful for them, Robyne. What we're talking about right now about this, I don't know. I think tension is the right word, right? Tension between sort of what's like really going on inside of us sometimes, and maybe how we feel we need to sort of present to the world sometimes, and these jobs we have or these things we're trying to do. You and I were speaking earlier before we hit record, just kind of having our own little life check-in a little bit, and we started talking about our own lives and how we have these careers where there's a keynote or a concert or a facilitation or whatever on the books, and it's on that date, and whatever's happened in your life that morning, you're still walking out on stage. Freddie Mercury, the show must go on in a way. Mm-hmm. And so we were talking about that experience of sort of having your inner experience and then needing to have this outer experience. And I think whether you're on stage as a speaker or performer or not, a lot of people can relate to that idea.
Yes.
Because sometimes just walking into the office or standing in front of your class as a teacher, or even just, being around humans at a bar or something,
Yeah.
there can be this disconnect that can happen. And so I don't know that I have like wisdom around this, but I know that I sometimes am surprised at how functional I'm able to be despite really like peak challenging experiences. I think about this week. I had a keynote for 8,000 government employees, and I had just like been through some of the most deeply personal challenges, and yet I was there and I was making people laugh, and it went extremely well, and so I'm reflecting, like, am I being inauthentic? Like, how do I reconcile that? And yet part of me feels like, well, doing that work is actually really meaningful to me, and I find it. Like, I think we talked about this the other day. It's like doing good work, and that's not necessarily inauthenticity, but it's sort of honoring the different parts of myself in different moments and spaces. I'd love your reflections, Rob.
Yeah, Peter, I just feel that so deeply, because there was times where, my world, not recently, but in earlier seasons where, my world was crashing and burning all around me. Like, I was living in this like blast radius of just pain and destruction and fear and loss. And I remember then being able to like walk in front. At the time I was still teaching at the university, and like literally I would be on the phone in my car outside the classroom talking to my lawyer, trying to figure out how am I going to be able to manage this. And then, 2 minutes later, I'm walking in front of hundreds of students, and we're going to talk about psychology today. And I had to like kind of carry those classes. And I remember thinking at times where it's like, is that normal? Like, can you literally go from shattered to all of a sudden put on your game face and then like go out there and then like do your job very well, whether it be teaching or in your case, performing or speaking. And, I always kind of struggled with that idea about like, which part is the real part? Like, is the real part of me like the broken and the shattered and the scared part who's going through this crisis? Or am I actually this like person who like can all of a sudden shut down their feelings and can like shut down the bigger picture and just have this laser focus on the task at hand, knowing that they're going to hit end, or the bell will ring, or the keynote will end, and then as soon as I'm by myself, I'm going to get this wave of all of the emotion again. Like, is that normal that we can like shut down and like transition so quickly between different states? And I remember for a long time, Peter, thinking like, okay, I don't think you should be able to like flip the switch that quickly. Right? Like, I feel as though like people needed to be like, okay, you'd have to like talk yourself into it, or you'd have to prepare yourself to emotionally switch from A to B. And the reality is, I think some of us learn how to do it really quickly, because ultimately at the end of the day, it's how we've stayed safe. And how we stay safe is the fact that we're able to kind of transition really quickly between really complex states. So I think part of it, it's a defense mechanism. It's a survival strategy that we can quickly shift and we can adapt. And the other part of it, and you've already alluded to this in your reflection, is the fact that there's parts to us. We're not all or nothing, just one thing. So that part that is nervous and scared and worried about what's going on, or grieving or reeling from what's happening in your life, that's a part of you. And then there's going to be another part of you, and it's all you, but that other part that's going to be like, no, I'm going to rally around that part, that vulnerability, that fear, that hurt, because it's like, no, I got you. And it's going to take the lead. It's going to take kind of center stage and help us go through it. And what's interesting is I used to always think of those parts of us as like kind of good or not good, like it was like a moral issue, and thinking that like stoic part of me that could shut everything down, like that was like, oh, that's not a good part to be able to have. But it's learning and leaning into all of the parts serve a purpose. right? All of the parts make sense. And there is a brave part within each of us, which in all of us, that can stand up in the face of adversity and be able to still do the job, still get up and do what's asked of you, even when there's other parts of you that are feeling really fragile and really maybe even broken at that point. But when we work as that mosaic of recognizing all of those parts are working towards keeping us safe, keeping us functioning, I think it creates a relationship with ourselves that can trust that we can figure things out, that we know what we need when we need it to be able to get through hard times.
I appreciate that so much, Robyne. We got a little furry visitor in the back
Little
there.
Paulo came to say hi. Oh, he's going to curl up with us.
I had I had a little bit of an epiphany there while you were speaking, and then I had one other reflection. So the epiphany, I guess, is that maybe, at least in my own brain, I don't know what other human beings experience, but I tend to think that the darker, more challenged parts are like the most authentic parts. It's almost like if you think about, for me as a songwriter, right? It's so much easier to write the sad songs. Like writing the happy song is I'm sure if you were to analyze the content of song lyrics, it leans 98% like people dealing with a challenge, and that's what causes them to pick up the guitar, sit down at the piano. It's not like my life is great, right? But this notion that maybe we sort of emphasize this part of me is really struggling, and therefore that is who I am and what I am. But there is also another part of me that's just as authentic, that's super excited to give this keynote to 8,000 people. And I've prepared like crazy, and I've interviewed all these people, and I've put together something that I'm really proud of, and I'm honored to get to do this. And so it's interesting that I sort of devalue the part of me that's happy and excited and wow, what an opportunity. And think that, but because I have this part over here, that it sort of invalidates the other. And so I feel like what you just said sort of helps make me feel empowered that those two things can coexist. And it also sends me to one of the kind of self-regulation techniques, that I've learned through therapy and different kind of practices in my life, is the idea of it being okay to just park something for a moment. And I've been doing a course with Terry Real, who's an amazing, couples therapist. And he talks about the idea of hey, we're just going to stop and go for a walk, or I'm leaving right now. I will be back. I'll be back. But you're allowed to take space and not talk about something for a moment. You're allowed to be okay, I'm going to set a timer, and for 5 minutes I'm going to worry about this thing, and then I'm going to not worry about it for a second. But I'm going to give myself that space, and this idea that it's okay to sort of park things, to set timers around things, and not feel like we need to be fully immersed in everything at all times. So I appreciate that so much.
Yeah, we talk about that, Peter, in the work around emotional boundaries, right? We're really big on physical boundaries. We're okay, I'm not checking email after a certain hour. I'm not going to do this. And especially with folks working with all these hybrid and versions of what the future of work looks like, there's so much dialogue on these physical boundaries, which that's great, right? We need to have physical boundaries. We need to make sure we're keeping ourselves safe. We kind of have the ability to time manage and whatnot. Those are super important. The conversation, though, that I sometimes think that we don't have is around those emotional boundaries. And it's okay to be able to say to someone in a conversation, this is triggering. I'm going to actually pause, and I'm not okay to talk about this right now. And that doesn't make us rude. It doesn't make us selfish. It doesn't make us too sensitive. It's simply saying, you know what? I'm not in the headspace to be able to have this conversation right now. And I'm choosing to put up this emotional boundary. And what I often talk about, and my favorite definition of boundaries is boundaries are, whether they're physical, emotional, there's lots of different types of boundaries, but talk about those two to begin with. The best definition is that's a system of either like it's like a system of yeses and nos that are going to enhance your life. And so it's not like keeping people out. It's just being really strategic in terms of like what you're showing up for and what has access to you. And when we think about our emotions, right? Like we can, for example, physically leave the job. Let's say our job finishes and our keynotes end or whatever it is, but we can actually carry like this emotional hangover or worry or something like into the middle of the night. Like we can just carry it for weeks and weeks and weeks long after an event has happened. And that's that piece where sometimes as a service to ourselves, we need to put in some emotional boundaries that said, hey, you know what? I have like thought about this, ruminated it, worried about it, talked about it. And you know what? Okay, like when is it going to be time that I can actually let this be released, or when I can actually put it down? And one of the questions that I use to prompt myself when I'm getting kind of struggling with emotional boundary setting, let's say, for example, I made a mistake, which happens all the time. And what's amazing is like I can carry that mistake with me for days and days, weeks, even months and decades. And one of the questions I pause when I notice I'm stuck with something is I ask myself like, okay, so when will I be okay to put this down? And like, when will be the right time? And often the time has long passed, right? Like, it's like, this is no longer serving anyone. I've learned from it. I've adapted. I've maybe made amends. I've apologized or whatever it was. But when you actually question it, like, okay, when will be the right time that I don't worry about this anymore? Often that time has already passed, which means in the present, we can let that go.
I appreciate this conversation so much, Robyne, and I'm sort of like connecting a few dots in my mind between like sort of like relational therapy and sort of how we show up as partners for our partners, and also in relationship to ourselves, right? Like again in the work with Terry Real, or I'm blanking on the author's name. There's a book called Hold Me Tight, which is like sort of a seminal work on therapy and couples and like the idea basically is like being able to let the person know, like, I love you, like, I'm not going anywhere, like, this is not the end, like, I need this boundary, this space, this walk, this whatever, right? And I think about the way that I've sort of learned through some of my mindfulness practices and these focusing techniques that I've done. And when I say focusing, it's a technique of like sort of witnessed mindfulness,
yes.
Where you're like practicing mindfulness, but you're saying, just for the listeners that may not, I didn't know about it until I started doing it. But one of the techniques in there is sort of kind of going into your body, and you might feel areas of different tension, and then you sort of allow yourself to turn those things into images, and these different parts of yourself emerge as you do this practice. And one of the things that you often do is those parts of yourselves often morph into like some kind of human form of some kind. Sometimes it's an animal, sometimes it's a color, but often it's like, I often have different parts that morph into like a child or something like that. And the technique is to sort of sit down next to them. And you don't actually ask them like a direct question. You sort of sit next to this part of yourself and you kind of just sit with them. And maybe you sort of sense like what's present for them. But you kind of like, you hold space for this part of yourself, and just sitting next to this part of yourself and just being like a warm companion or a safe and gentle companion, like it just causes this calm. It makes the big thing like just kind of get smaller. And so I'm kind of connecting this idea of, I think about so many people out there. I mean, literally most human beings on planet Earth, like, we're all wrestling with some kinds of disconnect. If we think about the global scale of trauma and stress, and just take a look at the news and then try to walk into a meeting, you're going to feel a sense of disconnect, or you'll be challenged in some capacity, I imagine. But to be able to give ourselves sort of that great relationship with ourselves, in the same way that we try to hold space or create healthy boundaries with our partners.
Yeah. Absolutely. And again, I just so appreciate that idea of the fact that, we're all on this kind of journey of learning how we can, coexist with these different parts, with these different experiences. Also just always reminds me of that piece around just the power of recognizing dual truth, where we can still be effective in our roles and put in boundaries. We can still take the stage and do the good work, and on the inside actually have just come from a very difficult experience or a difficult conversation. And one isn't right or wrong. It's the idea that these things can both exist. And when we start to kind of allow for that little bit more of that spaciousness to understand that dual truth and even triple truths of all of these kind of complexities, it creates, again, that spaciousness where we can show up in our lives, be able to make what matters most, make it matter most in that moment. And I think at the end of the day, that piece about being present to the experience. And I think a lot of people have gone at some point along the line, have just kind of picked up this pattern of behavior around mindfulness where they've kind of gone on autopilot, that they're not checking in with their feelings. They're not checking in with their emotions because it's hard, it's complex. And, for folks who are on that kind of autopilot train, my gentle invitation is that it's okay to slow down every once in a while and, ask, what is it that I need right now? Right. Even just as that, where would you even start with some of this mindful work? And maybe you don't have a coach, or maybe you don't have access to some of those resources. So where would you even begin? It's to just slow down long enough to ask yourself, what do you need right now? And that doesn't make us needy. It means that we're a human being and we have needs. And I think so often we've ignored our needs, especially because I think in Western culture, this idea of putting your needs out there is, again, it's either perceived as being selfish or being difficult, or even kind of that, hey, I don't want to be difficult to love, so I just want to make sure to keep my needs really small, or self-managed. And it really just opens that conversation up about the fact that it's okay that we have needs. It's okay that we have parts that hurt. And even if we do have lives that are very, very complex, there's moments in that where we're able to ground ourselves. We can kind of realign, reevaluate, and just show up in that, in that brave moment, whatever it's being asked of us.
Excuse me. I appreciate that, Robyne, and I always appreciate how you also make whatever we're talking about accessible to folks. And absolutely, I recognize that not everybody's going to have the time or the resource or whatever to have a mindfulness coach. But I'll share that right before coming on this session with you, I was feeling, many different parts of myself. And I literally just went on Spotify and I went on the playlist that said mindful meditation, and I put on my headphones and I sat and I listened to that and I breathed for 5 minutes, and that was powerful, and I think that's accessible to everybody. So I appreciate
Totally agree.
Your prompt there.
There you go. And I'm mindful of our time. And I know last segment we didn't get a chance to ask questions. Yes. So I'm going to jump in for a quick rapid fire question for you this time. I know you had a bigger question, but we'll go super small questions given that we're respecting time. I'm curious, what is the last song that stopped you, right? Either stopped you as in ooh, that's a good one, or you put it on your playlist. What was the last song that kind of caught your attention, Peter? And why did it catch your attention?
There's a song, I was just listening to it yesterday or 2 mornings ago by Anais Mitchell.
Okay.
And it's called Now You Know.
Oh.
And it's just, I almost don't want to give away I don't want to give away too much, because it's a journey to just listen to that song. I think you will adore this. I don't want to overhype it. But I mean, it's with in my current life state right now, it I want to swear, it really breaks my heart, that song. But I think it's cathartic, and it's powerful, and it's a perfect capturing of what it is to be a human being and a vulnerable human being. So highly recommended.
Okay, we'll definitely put that one in the. We'll put that one in the. We'll put that one in the show notes.
Yeah. All right. My question for you. This is the question that I had prepared for you the other day. And it's actually kind of connected to our mindfulness, it's not. It might be a very quick answer. But my question to you is, if you don't have to close your eyes if you're not comfortable, but whatever allows you to just kind of drop into your body for a moment. When you sort of scan your body and you think of the word love, where do you experience that in your body? And would you be willing to describe it?
Yeah, so when I think of the word love, I obviously feel it in my heart center, like I feel it there, but I also feel it so much in my mind's eye, and it's like instantly I see my 3 children, and instantly I see them like the very first time that I got to see them, because I do believe in love at first sight, and that was definitely the day that I got to meet them. So when I think of love, I feel it in my heart center, and in my mind's eye. I just remember the look of their little faces when I was entrusted to be their mom.
That's beautiful. And that's a little practice I like to do when I'm curious about different parts of myself, and maybe kind of connected to what we were talking about, is just asking yourself, where do you feel it in your body? And as you bring your focus and attention to that part of your body, maybe an image emerges, maybe some wisdom emerges, maybe some pain emerges, and you can sort of breathe into it. So thanks for doing that practice with me, Robyne.
Oh. Well, as always, thank you, Peter, for showing up for these conversations. And my intention always when we're able to connect and be part of these conversations is that people can join us as they reflect on some of these ideas, and to very much just send that message that you're not alone. So often we suffer in silence. So often we think that it's just us. And my hope is that we can bring some awareness to the fact that each and every one of us we're managing a lot, and we're going to figure it out. And just to take that kind of decision by decision or moment by moment, but just to trust that you're not alone. And I hope this can bring you some comfort and maybe even some tools or some ideas.
No better words to end it than what you just said. Thank you so much, Robyne. Love you, and love all of you listening, and we'll see you next time.